New York saw a deal of unrest, and in the wake of the assassination, Martin was defined by race, because most of the uprisings were of the African American population. But it went further than that because there were certainly discontented elements within the white population, and a general, if you like, unhappiness with the character of urban life, including even a resentment against the privileged suburbs, so that you had a suburban youth that was tired of the poor suburbs. There was a feminist movement that defined the suburb as a place with no name, which was their first major enemy because of the lifestyle that was being dictated. So there was a lot of discontent with the nature of urbanization in the 1960s, and I arrived in Baltimore to a university which had a great deal of money to investigate what went on in Baltimore, what the problems were in the city. And I became involved, therefore, in a detailed investigation of housing conditions in the city and what was wrong or what was right with the whole housing delivery system to marginalized populations. In the course of this, we collected a great deal of information, did a great deal of work interviewing, talked a lot with community groups, with various radical groups. We talked a lot also with bankers and federal officials and landlords and so on. And we created, at the end of this, a report on housing problems in the city. And this report was presented to a panel of people, bankers, landlords, federal officials and the like. And since I came from Britain, and one of the things I learned was that I knew how to write better than some of my colleagues, I ended up having to write the final report. And I had a great deal of liberty in how I wrote it. And at that time, it occurred to me that most of the social science frameworks that I was familiar with, conventional economics and sociology, seemed to me to be inadequate to deal with the nature of the problem. And I was feeling that I had no theoretical base upon which to argue for and about what was going on in the housing system. So, for that reason, I started to actually read Marx's Capital. Now, I started to read Marx's Capital not because I had some deficiency in my DNA, which meant that I was, radical for some reason. In fact, I was not particularly pro-Marxist at all when I started reading Marx's Capital. I had a hard time understanding what was going on in Marx's Capital. I thought some of the ideas were very interesting, but I didn't necessarily accept them as having any real relevance to what I was doing. But when I came to write the housing report, I thought that what I would do was to take one of the ideas which is on page 1, volume 1, chapter 1 of Capital, which is the distinction between use value and exchange value. And I would talk about the use value of housing, and I would talk about the exchange value of housing, and how there is a contradiction between the two. If the exchange value system doesn't work well, then large segments of the population do not get access to adequate use values. So I built the whole argument in the report around this conceptual apparatus which came from Marx. In the report, I didn't cite Marx, of course. To do so would have meant that nobody would listen to me at all. But what was absolutely stunning to me was the people who read the report immediately said, and this started off with a landlord and then a banker saying the same thing, that this way of thinking about housing was brilliant. They said, this is really a fantastic way to formulate the problem. And they were very excited about this whole analysis. And I thought, well, if I can get this far just with page 1 of volume 1 of Capital, I maybe should go on to page 2. And actually what was very interesting during this whole thing was, bit by bit, I found myself using concepts out of Marx without telling anybody where they were coming from. And actually everybody thought this made fantastic common sense. And they would say things to me like, well, oh yes, you're a geographer. Yeah, we thought you might be an economist and do all those silly things that economists do, which don't mean anything. So I actually began to think that Marx was a great way to understand what was going on in cities. And down the line, a couple of years later, I was in another conference with, again, financiers, landlords, politicians, and all the rest of it. And I made the argument which comes out of Engel's book on the housing question, where he says there's only one way the bourgeoisie solves its housing problems. It moves them around. It takes on a neighborhood, it makes it better, and actually displaces everybody who's living there in the process, so that the poor people end up living somewhere else. So the slum disappears here, but it emerges somewhere else. This was a kind of a theme of moving it around that became very important, and I continue to use it a great deal. In the conference there, I kind of said, you know, the problem in Baltimore is that we've had all these efforts to improve housing in this part of the town, and we don't notice that that part of town is going very bad. So the moving around in Baltimore could be documented, and I tried to document it. And I said, this is one of the big problems. We're not going to solve the housing issue in Baltimore until we start moving it around. Now, some of the politicians in the city had heard rumors that I was actually teaching Marx's Capital. So they started attacking me as some sort of communist radical who was kind of saying outrageous things. But to that conference, they had invited the vice chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank of New York, who was in charge of real estate development in New York. And Chase Manhattan had indeed attempted to do something about neighborhood deterioration. And the vice chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank stood up and defended me. It's the last time I've ever been defended, I think, by a vice chairman of the bank. But he defended me. He said, no, he's exactly right. This is what happened to us in New York. We took on this rundown area and we made it much better by investing money in it and everything. And at the end of the day, it turned out the people who were originally living there weren't living there anymore. They had been forced out and gone somewhere else. So this moving around problem, he said, is very, very significant. So there I was, defended, and afterwards, the vice chairman said to me, that's a fantastic idea, he said, you know. I mean, I wish you had written it up. I said, no, I haven't, except in, you know, the report here and there. And he said, well, you know, where did it come from? And I said, it came from Engels. And he said, oh, is he a professor at Harvard? So again, it was events like this that gave me immense confidence in not only the intelligence, but also the legitimacy of the Marxist analysis, into helping to understand urban processes. So it seemed to me that it was very necessary to actually unfold a little bit what goes on in Marx and get to understand it better. But I needed to understand those aspects of Marx which are usually neglected. That is, I couldn't attach Marx's theory to what was going on in cities without talking about finance and development, about fixed capital, about creation of built environments. I couldn't do that. And so I had to go to those passages in Marx which are usually neglected. A lot of volume 2 and a lot of volume 3. So while I was teaching Marx and mainly teaching volume 1, I was also arguing to myself, I should get to understand how the whole of Marx's work integrates all of these elements on finance capital and above all the question of land value and land rent and the role of that in urban development. So that led me at some point or other to think, well, I should actually get into Marx and try to develop an understanding of Marx that would help me understand what I really have always been interested in, which is urbanization and uneven geographical development. Now, my expertise on Marx, such as it is almost entirely derived from a reading of Marx which is not scholastic. That is, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the relation to Hegel. I don't worry about, Marx's relationship in general to German critical philosophy. I just kind of say, how does this help me understand urban processes as I was looking at them in the city of Baltimore? And later, as I started to do further urban studies in Second Empire Paris. How does it work? And so I started to write this book as a way of teaching myself how to write out Marx in such a way that it would help me in these very practical concerns that I had. Which meant that, of course, there were longish chapters in here about finance, capital, and money. There are longish chapters in here about rent. There's actually longish chapters in here about the production of space and spatiality, and also about fixed capital formation and creation of built environments. So there's a lot of work of that kind in here, which has turned out, I think, to lay the basis for almost all of the work that I've done ever since on urban questions. So this, if you like, is the theoretical book which gives me the basis with which I would approach something like the rebel cities question. And to me, therefore, there's an integration between this theoretical work and the practical work of understanding the dynamics of urban processes in particular places and times. Now, this, however, creates a little bit of a problem. And the problem was this, that in chapter 2 of volume 1 of Capital, Marx assumes he is working with a model of capitalism which is based on perfectly functioning markets, perfectly functioning competitive markets. Now, it bothered me for some time that Marx made this assumption, because clearly he knew, and I knew, that we don't live in a world of perfectly competitive markets. So why did Marx create a theory assuming there were perfectly competitive markets? And it took me a little while to realize that, of course, Marx's main source of inspiration, his main source of information, was in fact the classical political economists. I mean, Marx didn't go out and do ethnographic research. Marx did not go out and do sociological studies. Marx did read a lot in the archives, and particularly read through the reports of the English factory inspectors and lots of documents of that kind. But his primary source of information was reading the 270 or so classical political economists who had written about how to understand capitalism. And Marx's position was something like this. He said, look, there are at least 270 odd people who have written serious and sometimes not so serious attempts to understand the world that was emerging around them. They were not stupid. They were, in fact, very dedicated to their task. So you will not find Marx mocking Adam Smith or mocking Ricardo. He has a profound respect for what they did. But at the same time, he thought that he could take their writings, and by the application of critical inquiry, he could create an alternative understanding of how capitalism worked. And this, of course, is what Capital is about. The subtitle of Capital is a critique of classical political economy, and that is its main source of information. Now, Adam Smith and Ricardo tended to assume, in their theory, perfectly functioning markets. They had, if you like, a bourgeois utopian vision. And the utopian vision that they built up during the 18th century and into the early 19th century was that if you could let the market do its work and get the state out of the way, you would actually end up with a far, far better society than the one that we're currently in. Adam Smith's thesis was that if you have a perfectly functioning market, then the hidden hand of that market would guide decisions in such a way that everyone in society would be better off. Adam Smith was not an elitist in the sense that he deliberately sought to get the rich richer and make the poor poorer. Adam Smith wanted everyone to be better off. And in his view, the best way for everybody to become better off was for the state to take a very limited role. And the language which is used is that of laissez-faire, let it be. And the doctrine of laissez-faire came in very strongly, and basically the classical political economists argued, with some dissent here and there, that the best thing that could happen was let the market do its work and everybody would be better off. This was the utopian vision. Marx says, all right, let's suppose we have perfectly functioning markets. What actually happens? And then what Marx does, step by step in Capital, is to show that if you have perfectly functioning markets, then the result will be that the rich, the capitalist class, will grow wealthy beyond belief, while the poor, the working class, will become less and less wealthy. There will be perpetual degradation of the labouring force. There will be perpetual decline in the conditions of life of the working class. So what Marx shows is if you come close to that utopian vision, then this is what will happen. Now the interesting thing in the 1970s was, in many parts of the world, most of Europe, for example, and even in the United States, we were nowhere near close to perfectly functioning markets. The state was actively involved in redistributing wealth. In the United States, there was an anti-poverty program. In Europe, there were social welfare structures which were built up. Some very strong, like in Scandinavia, and in Britain to some degree. And so, the world that Marx actually lays out, the theory he lays out, particularly in Volume 1 of Capital, doesn't apply very well, or did not apply very well to what was going on around us in society. And the argument could indeed at that time be made that the theory as advanced in Capital was not relevant to understanding the social democratic welfare state kind of capitalism. And in fact, it really was not. So, it was not clear what the relationship was between that theory and the reality around us. What was intriguing to me, teaching Capital every year for about 40 years, is by the time we get to 1990, however, there's a completely different feeling. By 1990, there has been this vast attack upon the powers of labour. Unions have been attacked and partially disempowered. Labour parties and political institutions of that sort have been dismembered. Capital has become dominant and hegemonic. So by 1985, we find ourselves in a kind of world which is much closer to that which Marx described. And by the mid-1990s, I could take these accounts of labour conditions in factories in Bangladesh and Indonesia and actually give them to students and say, compare this to what Marx describes in the chapter on a working day in Volume 1 of Capital, and tell me if you can see any difference. And you couldn't. Think of what's happened recently in the suicides in China from the labour conditions in Shenzhen and Foxconn. Think what happened when the buildings collapsed in Bangladesh and thousands of workers died. These were classic 19th century events. And you could put them into Marx's Capital and just say, well, here we are. So the curious thing was that Marx was actually rather popular in the early 1970s for political reasons. But he was quite popular at a point where he was not actually very relevant. By the time you get to the 1990s, everybody declares that Marxism is dead. Nobody should read Capital at all because it's a defunct document. But in fact, Marx is much more relevant to understanding what is going on around us. And as the world progressed to the conditions today, after 40 years of neoliberal games being played at all kinds of levels around the world, we find ourselves pretty close to the sort of world that Marx assumes and describes in Capital. For example, the idea that the rich grow richer and the poor grow poorer. Just look at all the data throughout the advanced capitalist world in particular about what has happened to income distribution since the 1970s. Just look at these things called Gini coefficients or whatever. Inequalities have increased immensely. The more we move towards this sort of free market society, the greater the social inequalities, which is exactly what Marx would predict. And this is, it seems to me, a very important thing to understand. That Marx's argument is a contingent argument on the nature of the situation that we are in. And that to the degree that right-wing utopian dreams are being realized politically and economically, so the results which come to you out of Volume 1 of Capital become much closer to the truth. But then there's another issue. And that issue is what happens to this story when we read Volume 2 of Capital. Now, Volume 2 of Capital is quite a different story. And I've just finished the written version companion to Volume 2 of Capital. And one of the issues I take up is what's the relationship between the argument in Volume 2 and the argument in Volume 1? And there's actually a very simple relationship, which is spelled out in this text Marx calls the Grundrisse. And Marx actually says in the Grundrisse, you cannot understand capital without understanding the contradictory unity between production and realization. By realization, Marx means his capacity, the capacity of a capitalist to sell their product in the market. Now, throughout Volume 1, Marx assumes there is absolutely no problem of capital selling its product in the market. The assumption he makes is everything exchanges at its value. That is, there's no defect in the market at all. But in Volume 2, he problematizes that and starts to say, well, where is the market? And who is going to buy the product? Because there is a structural inequality inside of capitalism between supply and demand. That is, at the beginning of the day, there's a certain amount of money in circulation which is being laid out on wages and being laid out by capitalists purchasing means of production. And that total value is, if you like, the total value which is being launched into the market. But at the end of the day, you have something called surplus value, which is the source of profit. Where does the extra money come from to buy the product when the amount of money launched into circulation is just simply wages plus capitalist investment? This is a structural problem. And Marx analyzes it, and in volume 2 of Capital, he starts to say, a major crisis will erupt because there is not enough demand in the market to actually absorb increasing supply that comes from capitalists producing surplus value. Now this problem needs then to be addressed. And there are two features to it, which I think are significant. The first is that in volume 2, Marx says, if you do what you do in volume 1, that is, you depress the wages of workers further and further and further, then you have less and less of a market to sell into. And if you depress workers' wages too far, then you will have a crisis on your hands because there is not enough effective demand in the market. So he makes that argument in volume 2, which is very different from the argument in volume 1. So in volume 1, what you see is the conditions of labour of the working class and the amount of money and wages which they receive are going to go down and down and down, as has happened since the 1970s. But in volume 2 you see that if you go that path, then there's going to be a crisis of realisation. And this, of course, was something that Keynes took up in his general theory. That is, to start to look at the demand side as being more important than the supply side. This is, I think, a very important contradiction. It's a foundational contradiction. And actually, you can put a generalization on the history of capitalism. And the generalization would look like this. That from 1945 onwards, most capitalist countries followed a demand management strategy. That is, they expanded demand, they even gave more money to the working classes, improved wages, and that demand management was crucial to preventing the world going back into the depression conditions of the 1930s. So in the United States, for example, after 1945, in order to prevent the country sliding back into depression, there was launched a huge program of re-urbanization of the United States, which is known as suburbanization. There was suburbanization, which also carried with it the building of the interstate highway system, the building of vast sprawling suburbs in New York, the refashion of the sort of command of Robert Moses, the rebuilding of American cities so that they became mega cities. That absorbed vast amounts of capital. And it was the vast amount of capital that was not only caught up in the building, but was also caught up in the purchase of the automobiles, the oil industry, and the tire industry. And then, it is a huge, huge program. And my argument would be that actually what got the United States out of the Great Depression was the suburbanization of the United States after 1945. But the suburbanization of the United States after 1945 was the selective process in which privileged white unionized workers got more resources. They were the ones who lived in the suburbs. And there were many people who were left behind, and they were left behind in the inner cities. Hence, the uprisings in the inner cities, which were antagonistic to the suburbs. and the urban crisis of the 1960s, which was a byproduct of this strategy, which was demand-led strategy, but demand which was actually generated not only because of upper middle class purchasing, but also working class incomes of a privileged sector of the white, unionized working class. So this demand strategy worked quite well, until actually workers started to get more powerful. Because one of the reforms that had been set up in the 1930s was that unions should be legalized. And in fact, legislation was passed that made worker organizing easier. At the same time, there were other legislation passed which made it possible for that privileged working class to get access to home ownership. So we get the financial institutions which are set up at the end of the 1930s, which gave you the 30-year mortgage, which was insured by the federal government, and subsidies to home ownership. And this was both an economic project and a political project, because it was very hard to imagine revolution coming from the American suburbs. If it was going to be any kind of revolution, it would be a conservative revolution, and in many respects, it was. So that, as it was said in the 1930s, get incumbent homeowners and don't go on strike. So, trapping people into indebtedness was one way of exercising social control over their political activities. But at the same time, by encouraging workers to buy housing and become homeowners, that segment of the working class started to see home ownership as a way of saving for their future. They therefore became intensely concerned with the value of their house. They became intensely concerned not to allow anything to affect the value of their housing. And in housing markets, there is always this problem of externality effects. That affects people. If I invest a lot in my house, it raises the value of houses around me. If the people that the house beside me decay, it diminishes the value of housing. So people became very actively involved in the defense of housing values, which actually meant increasing segregation, increasing tendency to want to live in the equivalent of gated communities, increasing segregation in the housing market, which again was one of the main elements of protest which emerged in the 1960s, the urban crisis of that time. So this story then of urbanization and getting out of the crisis of the 1930s connects very much the formation of the situation which I encountered in Baltimore in 1969 and the strategies which were demand-led strategies which built into the whole question of, the dynamics of urbanization in that period. But the working class got rather ambitious. It had got quite a lot. It was well organized. The white working class was well organized. It was well organized in Europe. It had a political arm in the United States. Even the Democratic Party was very beholden to the unions. In Britain, you had a Labour Party. In many European countries, you had socialist and communist parties, which were becoming increasingly influential. So when you get to the 1970s, you have another crisis, which is a crisis of that system. And the crisis is partly a crisis of too much political power residing with the working class. But also it grows from the particular problems that Keynesianism sets up, which is always the danger of inflation. That is another different kind of crisis strike. So the 1970s became another period of crisis. And it was at that point that the capitalist class decided to launch this neoliberal project. They didn't do so because they read Hayek or Milton Friedman. They used them eventually as legitimation for what they wanted to do. They did it because they were simply threatened in their wealth and power by the working classes being too dominant. So they decided to destroy the power of the working classes by whatever means possible. And that meant a change of dominant economic thinking. Dominant economic thinking shifted from this demand-led strategy to a supply-side analysis. It basically said, get the conditions of supply right and capital accumulation will revive. And one of the key conditions of supply is the supply of labour power and the cost of labour power. So we set a deliberate strategy to depress the cost of labour power. And there were a number of strategies. One was immigration, another is globalisation, and the third is technological change. In fact, the strategies of technological change since the 1970s have been highly directed to disempower labour. When I went to Baltimore in 1969, the steelworks in Baltimore employed something like 37,000 people. By the time you get to 1990, it employs 5,000 people and is producing the same amount of steel. This is the sort of thing that then happened. The Steelworkers Union, that was incredibly important in the 1970s, is no longer significant, and it's lost, and Labour has lost much of its political power and begins to experience the problems of deindustrialization, and the loss of manufacturing jobs becomes a very serious problem. And because there is widespread unemployment and the like, and there's excess powers of labour available, then the working class becomes disempowered. You look at the data, the share of wages in national income from the 1970s goes down and down and down. The little period just went up in the 1990s in the United States, but it's down and down. Not only in the United States. This occurred also in China, it also occurred in many European countries. So this is, if you like, the situation in which the turn to neoliberalism was actually a turn to, if you like, the Volume 2 strategy. It's a turn to the Volume 1 strategy. But what that meant was you were going to get Volume 2 problems, which then led you to the question of, well, if the workers are becoming less and less wealthy, how on earth are we going to actually find the demand to absorb this extra products we're constantly producing? Well, one of the ways to do that was, of course, again, to support housing. So the housing strategies became, again, very significant in many parts of the world. But workers had less and less income to buy the housing. So one of the things you did was to say, well, we'll make conditions of credit availability easier and easier and easier. And so you find in the mid-1990s, under Clinton, there was a national housing initiative, which is very much about trying to give home ownership capacity to moderately well-off and then eventually even impoverished populations, all of whom were invited to join what's called the American dream, which is to be a homeowner in the suburb, even though actually for most people living in those conditions is a nightmare, not a dream. So this switch to a realization problem is actually covered over by the growth of the debt economy. And it's not only a debt of governments, it's also personal private debt. And much of that personal private debt, most of it, is locked up in housing. And people were drawn into housing in a very strong way from the 1990s onwards. And after the crash of the sort of electronics industry market, or the e-market, in 1999, 2000, 2001, a lot of money started flowing into the housing markets. And so we get this asset bubble, which then sets up that housing is not only a form of saving, but housing has become a speculative instrument for almost everybody. Everybody could start speculating on housing. Even relatively poor people with no assets could get into a house and then maybe sell it if housing prices continue to rise. Now this, again, puts us in a position where you have to start to understand what the relationship is between the use value of housing and the exchange value of housing. And that relationship became tenser and tenser and tenser from the 1990s onwards, to the point where it actually crashed in 2007 and eventually crashed big time in 2008. The result was that because of the way the exchange value system was functioning, somewhere between 4 and 6 million people lost their access to use values. Now the interesting thing about that was, yes, there were movements around these losses, but most people seem to believe that this was not a systemic problem, that if there was a fault in the system, it was their own fault. This is what comes from 30 or 40 years of neoliberal propaganda, which basically says you are responsible. You have to take command. And if something goes wrong, it's because you didn't do it right. So individuals will blame themselves and say, I made bad decisions and I got caught. Instead of saying, this is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. Now again, the reason I like this formulation of the contradiction between use and exchange value is quite simply that it then gives you a political angle. What would you rather do? Live in a society that is delivering use values for everybody on a reasonably equitable basis? Or live in a society that rations people's access to use value by how much money they have? Marx's vision was, at some point or other, we will be able to do without the exchange value system altogether. That we would just live in a world where people were directly involved in the production and use of use values. Now the interesting thing here too is that we've been through 40 years of propaganda that says it is much better that you get your use values through an exchange value system, because it's much more efficient than relying upon, I don't know, self-built housing or relying on government subsidies or some sort of collective forms. So we've been told that this is the most efficient, but actually when you look at it, it turns out to be grossly inefficient, particularly in its capacity to deliver affordable housing to marginalized populations. It can always deliver good housing to the rich. It's just that it cannot actually do it at all well for the poor. And this was the problem in the 1970s. This was the problem that Engels hit back in 1872 when he published the housing question. So this problem has been there all the time. But what we've been told in many parts of the world is that socialized housing is bad, but the private market is good. So Margaret Thatcher privatizes all of the social housing for as much as she could, with the result, of course, that affordable housing in central London is an absolute impossibility. And increasingly, of course, in New York City, affordable housing in Manhattan is an impossibility. If you want affordable housing and you don't have protections by living in some of the rent-controlled apartments that exist in New York City, if you don't have that, you have to live miles and miles. So if you get into Kennedy Airport, as I will tomorrow morning, around 6 o'clock in the morning, and you take the subway into the city, it is packed. And it is packed with women and people of colour predominantly going in to wake the city up. And they have a 40-minute commute to get into the centre of the city to do their job. They have to live way out on the periphery. So we're now actually in a continuity. And the thing that strikes me so much about the urbanisation questions, which are now with us, is that they are similar in kind to those which I could identify in Second Empire Paris back in the 1850s. They're similar to the problems which I encountered in Baltimore in 1970. And there is a continuity. And the continuity is here because capital has only a limited number of ways in which it can approach the housing question. And these ways are class biased. These ways are class loaded. And you can see the contradictions in this in terms of both the nature of the financing structures and also the actual building, the way the city is actually built. So again, it becomes very important to have some understanding of what is happening in terms of the dynamics of this housing market. And there's something here, I think, that is, very significant. There have been waves of speculative activity in housing markets before. There was, in fact, one in the 1920s, a big one in the United States. There was another one in the late 1960s. And of course, we've just been through yet another one. What happens is that actually housing starts to become a means, a secondary means, in some versions of Marxist theory, for the extraction of value. That is, let's suppose people in their jobs are getting more income because their wages are going up. Well, one of the ways in which the bourgeoisie could recuperate those wages, is by charging higher rents, by pushing property prices up, or by actually charging people interest on mortgages on inflated value housing. So that actually the circulation of capital has a differentiation between where value is produced, which is in the work process, and where the value is realized. And this actually operates internationally. My guess is, I haven't got any firm data, my guess is that the direct producers of many goods in the capitalist world in China are working on extremely low profit margins, extremely low, because they are contracted by organizations like Walmart, who keep, as it were, their rate of remuneration very low. And a lot of the value which they produce is realized by Walmart in the United States. So there's a transfer of value that occurs as this realization process moves, and the transfer of value can take value from production that can end up in the hand of bankers in the form of interest. It can end up with Walmart in the form of profit on merchants' capital. It can end up in the hand of landlords in the form of land rent. And actually, all of these secondary forms of realization are not secondary at all. They're foundational, because if they did not work, capital would not function. They're not secondary, they're foundational. And all of those aspects of realization occur in the city. And there's a big difference in left ideology between the prioritization of the place of work as where class struggle occurs, and tending to look at the extraction of rent, the extraction of interest, and high commercial prices as secondary forms of exploitation, which are not part of class struggle. My argument is they are just as much a part of class struggle as is the struggle over labour conditions in the workplace. That there is a unity between the production of value and its realisation is, as Marx says in the Woodbridge, a contradictory unity. But until you see the unity between the two, it's very hard to get from Marx's theory, which is dominated by readings which are very production-oriented. It's very hard to get to that, to urbanization. But when you start to look at the field of realization, it's all about urbanization. And it's realization of capital and it's creation of urbanization, which is actually dictated by the dynamics of capital accumulation. And therefore, if you want to build an alternative city, we have to think about building an alternative city, a more socially just city, which is actually outside of the logic of capital accumulation. This means extracting many of the things which we now get through market transactions from the market calculus. Housing should be a human right. There should therefore be a use value to which everybody has access. Education is a human right to which everybody should have equal access. In the United States, it's increasingly monetized. Higher education and even preparatory education is increasingly privatized. It costs $50,000 now, at least, to get yourself an education at college. $50,000 a year. The result of that is that we have something like $1 trillion of debt, which is now stuck on students. And in exactly the same way that the indebtedness of homeowners turned them into, if you like, easily manipulable political subjects. So the indebtedness of the student population is turning them into easily manipulable political subjects. Because the interesting thing is about educational debt. It's the one kind of debt you cannot get rid of by declaring bankruptcy. The only way you can get out of your student debt is die. And actually there have been some suicides as a result. So this is another place where education as a human right is now actually being transformed into education as a commercial product. The same is true of healthcare. In many parts of the world, there are socialized healthcare systems which are being increasingly privatized at the edges. In the United States, we have a privatized system, which is an absolute disaster. It's totally inefficient, but nevertheless, we're told it is the best kind of healthcare you could possibly get. Well, it's great healthcare if you're very rich and you have a very good insurance program. If you don't, it's a disaster. But again, what this says is that we should be concentrating and thinking about a world which is built around use values. That is, taking that basic contradiction between use and exchange value, what we do is to start to say, we want not to emphasize the exchange value side of that contradiction. We want to emphasize the use value side. And we want to build a society in which adequate use values are available to all, no matter what their status. And that is a political project. It's an anti-capitalist political project. And so the last book I just finished is about the contradictions of capital. And each one of these contradictions is such that you go to the other side of the contradiction and say, instead of exchange value being hegemonic, you make use value hegemonic. When it comes to production and realization, it's very interesting. The history of this is that the production side dominates. Capitalists produce things, whether you like it or not, and then spends a great deal of time persuading you that you need them, and you can't live without them. Which means that actually the world of consumption and consumerism is being propelled by an incredible need on the production side to define a market. Which is what advertising is all about, it's what subliminal advertising on television and so on is all about. And so this world is actually driven by the production of surplus value, and by God, now you've got to make people consume stuff whether they like it or not. There's an estimate in the United States that says, particularly in Christmas shopping, that about a third of the things bought go straight into the trash. They're completely useless or they break before you get them home. So nobody ever uses them. This is a chronic waste of resources. This is a chronic waste. Yet there's a lot of that going on. So instead of that, we actually move to the realization side and say, what is it that people basically want and need? Let's organize the production system so that it delivers what people want and really need for a decent, basic life. And that is a different kind of question than we are producing more stuff, we've got to find a market somewhere. We've got to advertise and get everybody to know. And there's a wonderful system now, by the way, which is actually maximizing the extraction of rents. And one of the themes that comes out right now is that increasingly urbanization is dominated by rental extractions. And capital as rent is becoming more and more significant. We're witnessing around the world something we call a land grab, which is taking the land and resources throughout Africa, nailing down uses of land in Latin America, usually by subcontracting relationships to Chinese or soybean production or something of that kind. So there's a land grab going on. And the land grab is forcing up land and property prices. And so we have a situation that even though we've just gone through this property crisis, in many parts of the United States it is still increasingly difficult for ordinary people to find a space to live in because rental extractions are so high. Property prices in New York City are going up. Property prices I think here in São Paulo have been going up. Property prices in Shanghai have been doubling some years. Everywhere. The power of the rentier has become even more significant. And as the power of the rentier grows, so that becomes, I think, more and more significant for how we understand the dynamics of what's going on in urban areas. In other words, urban areas are sites of excessive rent extractions. At the same time, they're also sites of excessive consumerism, excessive merchant capital predatory practices. My favourite foes these days are the telephone companies. I don't know if you've noticed what goes onto your bill, but it's all bill, extra things like this. I say, what the hell is that for? So this is the world we moved into. And there is, if you like, an antidote to it, which is to start to think of an anti-capitalist struggle that moves to the other side of a contradiction like use and exchange value, goes to use value, minimizes the exchange value impact, and eventually eliminates it. There's a strategy there. And it has to be, as I've said, deliberately anti-capitalist. Because we're not going to change our cities by just changing this piece of the city and resisting gentrification here or an excessive kind of mega project there. You have to get to the root of the whole argument, which is one of the reasons why I so much like markets of capital, which you get a systemic picture of how the system works as a whole, provided, of course, we're able to understand the links that go on between, say, volume 1 and volume 2 of capital, between the various aspects of production and realization of value, and we get the story right. And there I hope is a story which I help to tell in Letters to Capital, and I think it's one of the reasons why, for me, the book is still incredibly important and incredibly relevant. So why don't I leave it there? So thanks very much.